Okay, here we are. Um, know your camera. And the reason we're going through all this camera stuff is that that you need to be able to control your camera, and you have to know the controls and displays in order to do that. And you can't, when something is happening that you need to take a picture of, you can't pull out the manual and look at it, or look up the manual on your phone and so forth. You need to know what to do. So, so our first step, which we're still on here really, is learning your own camera, its controls and displays. Then we're going to move to the settings that you need, and so that you can know what settings you need. And basically that's going to be why you want one shutter speed versus another, why you want one aperture over another or another range, and why you want one ISO compared to other ISOs. Once you know that, you can intelligently compromise between them. And if light is limited, you will be compromising between them. You always do. This doesn't mean that we do everything in manual mode. We use manual mode sometimes when it's most appropriate, but by no means always. We often use automatic, but we pay attention to what the automatic gadget is doing if there's time. And if there's time and it's doing the wrong thing, the idea is to be able to recognize that, step in and slap the silly gadget down and make it do what you need. Last time we gave 2 examples of shutter speeds that you need. And those are the red numbers there. And those have to be memorized. There's no substitute for simply knowing those things. And there's more coming. We're gonna delve into the controls and displays of the camera further, and then we're going to spend quite a bit of time on what the different settings do and what you need. And given all that, you can make the intelligent compromises. This is our steps and stops from last time. This is the most fundamental thing. This is the fundamentals of controlling exposure with a camera. There are only 3 parameters involved. They're how long the shutters, how much time the shutter is open, and how big the aperture is or isn't, and how sensitive the image sensor is, which is the ISO. In other words, the shutter speed, the f-stop, and the ISO. Those are the only things that determine the exposure. But it makes a big difference which ones you use. If shutter speed is too slow, you'll get an unacceptably blurred image. If it's too fast, you'll be wasting light that you may need for other things. If the aperture, and we'll get into what different apertures and different ISOs do later. I'm not going to complicate things that much now, but the point here is that these are the 3 things that are important, and you can make changes in any of them, and you can compensate with any of the others for the change and get the same effective exposure. That's the real key point. Let's see, the 2 columns on the right are really a single column. The right-hand column goes below the left column of those 2. So it's a single progression. but it's so big that I had to split it into two columns to get it on the chart. Okay, and the numbers on the right are fractions of a second. So the red 100 is 1/100th of a second. The 80 above it is 1/80th of a second. The 1000 down a ways is 1/1000th of a second, and so on. And um, and the next slower number than the 10, which is a tenth of a second, is the 8 at the bottom of the column to the left, which is 1/8 of a second. And then 1/6 of a second, 1/5 of a second, a fourth, a third, 1/2.5 of a second, 1/2 second, 1/1.6 of a second, 1/1.25 of a second, and then 1 second. And that little quote mark on some cameras means seconds. Other cameras will actually write out seconds. Depends on your camera. The 1.25 is 1 1/4 seconds. Going on up, you've got 2 seconds, and further up, 10 seconds, and so on. Those are extremely long shutter speeds and generally can't be used without some kind of camera support, but many cameras have them. And this progression for all these parameters will break off at some point, be limited at some point by your camera. For example, on the f-stops, which from the left is the second column of numbers, those are aperture. The 1.4 at the top is a very, very large aperture. Most cameras don't have that large an aperture. The limit is typically in the 4, 3.5, 5.6 range. It generally won't. It generally be 5.6 or better, or lower number. But they usually won't go all the way to 1.4. They probably do go exactly to f22. Sometimes they'll go beyond f22. The next one is 32, and the one after that is 45, and then 64. And you'll probably never see any of those numbers except 32, if that. And then the ISOs are the far left column. Those will typically have something like 100 as the lowest value, and the going up, they'll stop at the sensitivity limit for your camera, which varies widely. It can be 1,000, it can be 3,200, it can be 10,000, it can be 12,600 above that. It can be 25,000, 560, whatever. It's just that's just whatever your camera has. These are the actual values that virtually all cameras have, and there's the step between them for every one of these parameters is 1/3 of a stop. A stop is a factor of 2. And so going 3 steps will double the exposure or cut it in half, depending on whether you go up or down. You can see that most clearly in the shutter speed world. So if I'm at 1/400th here, and I go 3 steps up, which means 3 steps slower shutter speed, 3 steps more light, that would be 1, 2, 3. That's a factor of 2, and indeed that's 200th of a second, which is twice as long as a 400th of a second. It's the factor of 2. 3 steps here is always a factor of 2. In every case, it is a factor of 2 in aperture as well, in the amount of light you get. But the numbers don't change by a factor of 2. That's the nature of f-stops. if somebody wants to go into the mathematics behind that, I'd be happy to, but we'll do that after class. And then ISO again is just linear. 3 stops is a factor of 2. From 200, 1 stop, 2 stop, 3 stops, that's a factor of 2. That's twice as sensitive. At ISO 400, you only need half the light that you needed at ISO 200. And at ISO 200, you only need half the light that you needed at ISO 100. Okay? And so if you are at the red numbers, and this is why there are red and blue numbers for this example right here. If you're at the red numbers, 1/100th of a second, f16, ISO 100, and you choose to change the shutter speed from 100 to 400, that's 6 steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, given that the red numbers were the correct exposure, and you've changed the shutter speed by 6 steps in the direction of making the image darker. So there's 6 steps less exposure there. And darker is down on this chart. And with these numbers, darker is down and lighter is up. So that was 6 steps darker. Now to correct for that, you need to move 6 steps up in the other 2 columns. You could go from F16 up 6 steps. That would be F8. That would be fine. What I've done in this example is I moved up 4 steps to F10, and then I moved to ISO and moved up 2 steps to ISO 160. So it was 6 steps down, 4 steps up, plus 2 more steps up. That's 6 steps up, 6 steps down. The red numbers and the blue numbers will both be the same exposure. So if you count steps here and count up, if you have the right exposure and you make a change, any number of steps, any direction, then you can make the same number of steps change in either of the other or both of the other 2 columns to compensate and keep the right exposure. Clear enough now? The step in all these columns, the steps are 1/3 of a stop, and a stop gives you a factor of 2 change in exposure. So the steps are the same proportional amount. I realize the numbers aren't linear with the F stops, but that's the way it is. These are the numbers that people have used from time immemorial. I can explain where it came from and what the numbers are, if you wish. Very briefly, the F numbers are the square root of the aperture. In other words, they're they're the square root. They're square root, where the others are linear. In other words, if I go now, that's more complicated than it's worth.
You lost me at square root.
Don't feel bad, Bob. That's happened every time we've mentioned square root in this discussion.
Yeah. But anyway.
The column of numbers that you see for aperture are determined by the diameter of the opening in the lens, but the amount of light that gets in is the area, and that's why that square root gets into there.
Take your camera and set it for manual control, including manual ISO, no flash. Set your zoom to the widest angle, though that isn't really that important. We're not going to worry about a blurred image or noise or anything. This is strictly exposure. And determine the exposure that's appropriate for your lighting and camera and everything. Just make a guess. You can leave it where it's set or just use some random settings and take a picture. And if it's too light, then that means you need to move down in one or more of these three columns. And if it's too dark, that means you need to move up in one or more of those columns. And just do that until you get it looking about right. And then write down the three numbers, the ISO, the F number, and the shutter speed that you're using.
Just remember, if what you're getting is too dark, go up the columns on one or more of the ISO, aperture, or shutter. If what you're getting is too light, go down the columns on one or more of ISO or aperture or shutter.
Yeah. And make sure the lens cap's off.
I did check that, and it is off.
Hey, that's a mistake everybody makes.
Yeah. You know, as wonderful as the classic Leica rangefinder camera is, one of the real dangers of it is that you can shoot a whole roll of film with the lens cap on and have no clue because you're not looking through the lens with the viewfinder.
Oh yeah. Well, and you can do that with a sheet film camera too, where the film is a lot more expensive.
Anything I can help with or no?
Yeah.
But the fact that you're looking through the lens with a single lens reflex type camera or with a mirrorless digital camera, that saves you from all sorts of mistakes with lens caps. It has saved me so many times. I look and, oh, it's dark in there. Oh yeah, I know why.
I think one of the things that hasn't really made it very much into so-called serious dedicated cameras is this computational photography stuff. But as that does get into serious cameras, it'll be very useful.
What do you mean, Rick?
Oh, an example would be if you want to shoot in a dark scene and get lots and lots of depth of field, with computational photography, you can take a series of images at different focus distances and let the computer compose them into one seemingly very, very large depth of field image.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, with computer processing of multiple images, you can do things that are simply not optically possible.
Yeah.
You can remove the optical limits to a considerable extent.
I mean, another example is when you're trying to be cheap, lenses can have design flaws that are consistent but significant. And with computational photography, you can compensate out a big fraction of that design flaw after you take the shot. And you didn't have to spend the money on making a sharper lens with fewer aberrations.
Yeah, particularly chromatic aberration is really dealt with well. What is your camera?
It's Canon, something or another. Canon EOS T.
Yeah, it's a Rebel. So it
Rebel,
has the
right.
PAVTV-M markings on the main control dial.
Right. So
and
I'm
you want to
supposed
be in the M position.
Okay.
And then I think, if I remember correctly, one of the up, down, left, right buttons on that control wheel on the back of the camera will be marked ISO. And if you tap that, you'll be able to use the control wheel under your index finger to increase or decrease ISO or choose auto ISO.
Now, when I hit the ISO, well, maybe I shouldn't have hit memory. Okay, here we go. ISO. Okay, 800. All righty. Thank you.
Okay, have you got an exposure that gives a good-looking picture in manual mode?
Good looking as in not too light and not too dark.
Right. Yeah, we're not concerned with the artistic side of photography at all here. We're just trying to get the exposure. We will deal with artistics, but that's later.